And I hope your heart is stirred and ready and willing and humble to accept what God's word for you is this morning. I hope you don't ever cease and grow tired of hearing of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That we are still sinners in need of God's grace. That though we are covered by Christ's righteousness, we are still in need of it every day from the moment we received it. And we began 2 weeks ago scaling the mountain of God's holiness to understand that God has a standard that rises above every human standard. What does it mean to be one who has reached God's standard of holiness? In evangelism, we're going to learn this together. And if we take some evangelism classes, if you have around here, this is a great question. Do you consider yourself to be a good person? Boy, you will get a lot of answers in the world, won't you? Do you consider yourself to be a good person? If you're seeking or searching after Christ, that's the question for you. Really, that Paul is going to answer emphatically in the text, that no one's good. You may consider yourself a good little boy or a good little girl or a good adult, but you're measuring yourself by a human standard. I say to people I'm witnessing, if Adolf Hitler was the standard of what it means to be a bad person, then all of us are going to heaven. If it's long as you're not as bad as him, then all of us are going to make it. We call ourselves good because we're better than. But see, that's not God's standard. God's standard rises above every human measurement, and it rises so high into the mountains that it is his very holiness. We begin last time together going through this jaw-dropping section of Romans that started in verse 8 and goes all the way until chapter 3, verse 20. And the goal is to help you and I see that man has a universal need of salvation. So Paul is going to just expound on the gospel. Remember Romans 1, 16 and 17. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. That's the thesis statement. Now he's going to explain in in-depth detail how bad is man really? Are they really that bad? Are we mostly good but some bad? Are some just really bad but most everybody else is pretty good? See, Paul is going to teach us that it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how religious you've been. It doesn't matter that you haven't gone there and done that. Or you haven't done those things that other people have done. You have fallen short of God's holiness. His standard is perfection. And so it should lead us to the Savior. 2 weeks ago, you remember, I said you don't seek for a cure unless you're first convinced of what? That you are what? Sick. You will not seek a cure or help unless you are convinced you're sick. You will not ask for directions unless you know you are lost. You will not be saved out at sea unless you are first convinced you're in danger and you're drowning. See, Paul's goal for us is to see that God is so rich in mercy that even though we have plunged to the depths of depravity, that even though none of us are good, all of us have fallen short, it is God's grace that has plunged even deeper than our sin could ever. And that's something to rejoice about, isn't it? Do you still struggle with sin? I hope you realize that. Do you still realize when you're out and about in the world that when you see people in certain lifestyles, in certain ways, doing certain things, that you are no better than they are? You should have compassion because God has shown compassion on you. See, God's wrath is revealed in verse 18 of Romans 1 because all have sinned and because all this is what we're going to build on this morning, all have suppressed the truth. Now, all isn't us and them. It's not believers and unbelievers. It's all people have suppressed the truth that they knew about God. And instead of seeking after him with the light that they had, they chose to seek to snuff it out, even though they never could snuff it out. And they chose to turn away. See, God has given every human being an inner light. And this light is given to each and every human being so that they will seek after God. They know that he exists. So they will either be drawn to the light and say, I want to know this creator, or they'll say, no, I want nothing to do with him. And Paul says, before we knew Christ, that's what all of us did. Every time you and I sin, we revert back to our old life and say, I will spurn the light. I will forsake the light, which is Christ and his gospel. See, every human being has been given this truth. That's what Paul says in Romans 1:18. So let's read Romans 1:18 down to verse 20, and we'll expound on. Paul begins a descent of human sinfulness or human depravity, that none are good, none seek after God. So look at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness, what do? They suppress the truth. Remember what I said about that, kids, 2 weeks ago? If you ever playing in the lake and you have something that floats, and if you're going to try to hold it under the water to hide it from your friends, you got to constantly think about how you're holding it under, because you don't want it to pop up, because if you don't consciously hold it under, it's going to pop up and your friends are going to see it. You got the ball. Well, what does the Bible say? That you kids, you know the truth about God. You know that he exists. You know that when your parents say, honor your father and mother, children obey you know that that is right. But sometimes you want to hold it under the water and say, I don't like that. I don't want to obey that. And all of us adults did it as kids, and guess what? We do the same thing, don't we? Sometimes. So they suppress the truth. This is all people without Christ take the truth and they hold it down. But you can't hold the truth down without actually, you have to consciously be aware of it. It's not that you aren't culpable, you aren't responsible, you have to hold it down. All people suppress the truth. Now, verse 19, he starts to begin, how does human beings, you and I, before we knew Christ, and those who don't know Christ, how do they hold that truth down? How do they hinder that truth from coming to the surface? Look at verse 19. For, these are reasons. Whenever you see for or because or since, these are reasons. Reasons for, verse 18, the wrath of God. Verse 19, for what can be known about God is actually plain to them, clear. For what can be known about God in verse 19 is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Who's the them? We talk about in English antecedents. Antecedents are when it says them or his or her, who is it referring to? Well, the them is the people who have suppressed the truth. Human beings, you and I, before we knew Christ. And when I revert to my old life and say, I'm going to sin and I don't care, guess what I'm doing? Suppressing the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Now, verse 20. Here's another for. So another reason overlapping the previous reason. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. In the things that have been made, and here's the conclusion then. So they are without, what does it say? Excuse. So this is the age-old question, is it not? How can God hold somebody accountable to him if they don't have all the information? Maybe somebody born and raised in New Prague never once had somebody share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. Do they get a pass? What about the Aboriginal nations who have yet to have heard the gospel of Jesus Christ? Do they get a pass? Because they cannot be held responsible for what they don't know. Can somebody say to God, I was never told of your existence. I never heard anything about you. Therefore, you cannot hold me accountable. See, Paul is going to say, and he's going to descend. Okay, we're descending. Have you ever been to a cave? You guys ever done caves before? I've done a few caves. You get in that elevator and you need to descend down into the cave to go down and visit the stalagmites and stalactites and tights and whatever tights are down there. Paul is descending down into the depths to show you and give you a tour of sinful human depravity. And it begins where? You can answer the question. Where does it begin? At what level? Worship? Idolatry? They don't like God? Well, it begins at the level of creation. Okay, so this is somewhat of an apologetic, right? We get the word apologetic, which means argument, Christian apologetics. Why do we believe what we believe, and how do we defend throughout history when people say, hey, that you can't believe that, or that doesn't make sense? Apologetics are the study of how we defend the Christian faith. But Paul is descending down into human depravity, and he begins the tour at the level of creation. See, the wrath of God is revealed for a number of reasons. So verse 18, the wrath of God is revealed. Now he's going to explain the reasons why the wrath of God is revealed. He's not going to leave us saying, well, okay, we learned 2 weeks ago, his anger is not like our anger, so he's just. So then what about those people who don't? Those pagans, those people who haven't heard the gospel, people who maybe their whole life they never heard it. This is the question that Paul's going to answer for us this morning. And here's the main idea. So if you're writing down, you're taking notes, you're tracking with me mentally, this is it. And we see it at the end of verse 20, that the creation itself is enough to hold all people accountable to God. Okay? You got to think about this with me. The creation itself, God's creation, his created order, what we see, what we feel, what we smell, what we touch, all of his creation is enough. If all you had was that, you are accountable to the holy, just, and righteous creator of the universe. You cannot say ignorance is bliss. No human being could say that before a holy God. So the creation itself is enough to hold all people accountable to God. And then we're going to answer this question. How does God's creation create this universal accountability? Okay, so universal accountability is the idea that all people are going to stand before God. As the Lord says in his words, that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Okay, so then how does creation create this universal accountability? Well, thankfully, Paul gives us the answer. All right, and he gives us two answers from this text of how God's creation creates this universal accountability. Now, in theology, we sometimes use big words. Maybe you're familiar with some of these, but we sometimes talk about revelation. Revelation is what God has revealed to us. So there are two things: natural revelation and special revelation. Natural revelation is those things in the universe that are available to all people. The creation, my conscience, the ability to know right from wrong, the fact that the rain rains down on the just and the unjust, that God provides for people who even curse him. This is natural revelation. God has said something about himself to all people through his creation when they look outside themselves and even when they look inside of themselves. How do I know right from wrong? Why do we think some things are good, some things are bad? Where do we get that moral compass? Certainly, if we are just an animal, that could not be the case. So how does God's creation create this universal accountability? Well, we have to know first, right off the bat, that the evidence of creation, we have to know what it can do and what it can't do. Okay? The evidence of creation can point to a creator who you are accountable to. Because if somebody designs, actually creates the material that they're going to shape something and fashion it at their own will and create it at their own power, who does it belong to? It belongs to the Creator. A pen doesn't get to decide how it will be made. A car doesn't have any decision about whether it will be blue or red or black or these wheels or a truck. The Creator decides that. So the creation can point to and does point to a Creator, but what the creation and natural revelation cannot do is tell you how to be in a right relationship with God. When you go outside and you see the creation, kids, you were in Sunday school. When you go outside and see the creation, do you see the gospel written in the clouds saying, you must understand you're a sinner in need of God's forgiveness, accept his son? It's not written in the creation. You need more information. You need special revelation. You need God's word. You need God to step into your world. So, answer number one. How does God's creation create this universal accountability? Here's the answer in verse 19. God's creation affirms his undeniable existence. You cannot deny it. You can deny it with your lips if you want, but you know deep down in your heart that he undeniably exists because of the things that are made. Now look at verse 19. For what can be known about God is what? Blurry? Distorted? You got to be really smart? What does it say? For what can be known about God, that he is the creator, is plain. That word plain, other synonyms, clearly known, easily known, evident. It's not hard. 1 + 1 = what? 2. It's not hard. The creation affirms God's undeniable existence. So for a creature to live as if God does not exist is to deny their very existence. Yet they're without excuse, and yet they know that he exists. They have to hold that truth down. We're going to talk more about that. Here's really the idea. God's creation affirms his undeniable existence, and this is it. If you are seeking to share the gospel with somebody who claims they do not believe in God, if you go right to the gospel, it's going to mean nothing to them. They don't believe in a creator in their mind, even though they're suppressing that truth. They know there's a creator, but it's convenient for them to deny him. If you go straight to the gospel, it's going to mean nothing to them. You must first argue the case of creation with them. You have to be wise in how you speak, wise in how you share, and of course, speak the truth in love. If you're not loving about it, don't speak at all. Here's the main idea. If you're talking with somebody and you recognize that they're claiming that they don't believe there's a creator, you must use the designer argument. If something is designed, it must have what? A designer. If something looks created, is obviously created, then it must have a creator. Because denying the creator is denying the basic laws of cause and effect. You don't need to be present to see how it was shaped and how it was formed, to know that it was shaped and that it was formed, because there it is, shaped and formed. So if you're talking with someone, pick out something, pick out their hat, pick out their car, pick out something and say, hey, do you know who it was that made that shirt? Were you there when they made it? No, I don't know him. Then how do you know that it exists? Well, because I have it, because you use that type of reasoning with them to try to help them first. If you're going to try to get to the gospel of Jesus Christ with them, you must first help them see there is a creator. And here's the thing that you know that they may be deceived, is they're actually suppressing that truth. You have a little inside information. They know there's a God. It's plain, it's obvious. They just don't want to open their eyes. They have opened their eyes. They had the light of creation. They know he exists, but they've decided to close their eyes. basic laws of cause and effect. We were in South Dakota, never been to the Badlands, never been to the Black Hills, haven't seen Mount Rushmore. I don't know how many of you have, but I didn't realize, like, you're just driving down the road and there's Mount Rushmore. Whether you pull in there, it's just like, it like assaults you with its majestic glory. That somebody had an idea, hey, you know, the Black Hills could be a tourist area. I wonder if someone would want to carve a bunch of stuff, some heads into these. And sure enough, some guy comes along and then they get the funding. 13 years it takes, but it actually only took 6.5 years to sculpt it. It was because with government and funding, you know how that goes. So they got her done. So we go see Mount Rushmore. And I'll tell you, the wind can erode certain aspects of the landscape, right? You go to the Badlands, the wind obviously can shape some of the landscape. But if the wind ever created, has the wind ever created faces carved out of rock? I wasn't there. I didn't talk to the Creator. I don't know without a shadow of a doubt with my senses, with my own eyes, that they were there and did that. But how do I know that someone created those figures on Mount Rushmore? Because there they are. They're designed. There must be a designer. And it was really fascinating learning how they did a replica model and then used a pointing system and erected this huge kind of conveyor that would drop down, and then they would take their replica model and then they would know we got to blow out this area and we got to carve out that area, and just made it look amazing. Designer. God's creation proves that he undeniably exists. Everybody knows it. If you say you don't know it, you're just lying to yourself, because you know there's a creator. Now, if you look at verse 19, not only is it plain, but God has declared it to be plain. So if someone were to say to you, well, I don't think it's plain. I don't think it's clear. I need more evidence. I need more information. Well, we must believe God. When God says that something is plain, it is plain. God has made it plain to them. Why is it plain? Verse 19, because God has shown it to them. A little child knows there's a creator. A little child knows that things don't exist and come about from nothing. A little child knows that an explosion doesn't create a building. But what are we taught? We are taught in our public schools, and we are taught all throughout to accept that naturalistic Darwinian evolution is to be accepted as a fact. And there is no proof. But what has our culture done in our school system? What has our culture done? We have suppressed the truth so much that we put it in our textbooks and say, let's tell our kids that this is the truth, that nothing created something, and then that something decided to become intricate, and over years and time, all those parts kept adding, and here we are. You know what that is? That is stupid. It's stupid and illogical. And as man scales the mountains of complete ignorance, saying there's no God, there's no God, there's no God, they scale it and they think they're so smart. And I heard this said this week, I don't know where the quote came from. They think they're so smart. They're climbing the scales of ignorance. Oh, we're so smart. And just as they come over the crest, you know what they see? They see a band of theologians who have been there for centuries. Because they're just suppressing the truth. They don't want God to exist. They know that he exists. Kids, nothing doesn't create something. And even if nothing did create something, how did all the parts get put together with an intricate design so that they all work? Why does the universe work together for the common good of the creatures in that universe? We need oxygen. But we breathe out carbon dioxide. The trees take it in and they recycle that. That's just an accident. Don't believe it for a second. I was in the public school. I was in science class when a teacher told me When a teacher said, and he sought to ridicule anybody who believed in a creator, and he said, how many of you believe there's a creator? And he wanted to see if kids in 7th, 8th grade would raise their hands so he could ridicule them. Kids, you have to stand for God. Don't put that truth under the water. You don't believe just because some adult tells you nothing creates something, you know in your heart that is not true. You know it. Now, I'll tell you this. In this first answer to this question, that God's creation reveals his undeniable, affirms his undeniable existence. There really is no such thing as authentic atheism. There are people who claim to be atheists. I know this. There really is no such thing as authentic atheism. There's only convenient atheism. According to God's word, nobody truly, genuinely, authentically is an atheist. It's only a convenience. Because one, the Bible declares all people know there's a creator. So denying his existence is convenient in that it removes what? Accountability. I don't want God to exist because if he does, then I have to answer to him, and I don't answer to anybody. Welcome to America. I don't want God to be true because then he's my authority. I don't want him to be the ruler of my life. I'm the ruler of my life. I want my freedom, and that's defined as I'll do whatever I want. But you know what this is? This is like a criminal saying to a judge, I know that you've given me that sentence, but I don't believe you exist. Could you imagine a criminal saying to a judge, he pronounces the sentence to the criminal deserves it, he knows it, but he says, Judge, I don't believe in you. I don't believe you exist. I will close my eyes. It doesn't matter. You will face the punishment for the crime. Doesn't matter what you tell yourself. It's like somebody jumping off a cliff saying, I don't believe in gravity. You will. You will. See, in Psalm 119, don't have time to go there, but Psalm 119, it says, go read it later this afternoon, meditate on it. The heavens declare the glory of God. Night after night, they pour out speech. If you listen, if you look, you will see the Creator in his creation. If you take that light that you have of the creation, if you don't spurn it, if you don't hold it down, it will draw you to want to seek after God. You want to know him. I'm created for a purpose. Wonder why we have so much depression in our culture, so much anxiety, so much wondering, am I valuable? Am I valuable? When we've taught our kids that they are nothing. You came from nothing. You are nothing. You know what you are? Nothing. Wow, wonder why we have such problems in our culture when we're telling kids they're nothing. They're nothing but just an accident. They're nothing but just a blob that decided, hey, I'll be too. And here we are, just cosmic accident. There's really no point. And actually, how we came about, they say, was through people killing each other over and over and over again. Oh, but make sure you don't kill your neighbor. Yeah, that makes sense. Right? We live in a culture where people are struggling because they don't even see that they have value because they're being taught there is no creator, therefore you have no value, therefore do whatever you want, which leads you down to more despair because it doesn't ultimately satisfy because only God can satisfy you. See, there is no such thing as authentic atheism. And we'll see more of that in a little bit here. But remember, lest this tempts us to go through this passage and always think about everybody else, remember this passage is actually talking about you and all of us without Christ. This isn't a, hey, let's think about everybody else and how bad the world is. I want you to think about you. That before Christ, and even when you choose to sin, even now, you know what you're doing? You actually suppress the truth that God is creator, he is your authority, and you say, no, I'm going to do my own thing. You and I do that when we sin. This is why we need Christ. That's why we need to walk according to the Spirit. Because you know what it really comes down to? You might find this chuckle-worthy. You might say this to your kids. Oh, my parents probably did for me. Don't live like an animal. Don't be an animal. A bunch of animals. Don't live like an animal. You know what animals are like? They don't think about their creator. They don't think rationally. They just think instinctually. They just go about their life doing what God created them to do. And guess what? There's nothing wrong with that. They are creatures that God has made, not in his image. They're instinctual creatures. But when you and I live like no thought to our creator, no thought to our existence, no thought to submitting to him, just going about my business, you know what you're doing? You're living worse, actually, than an animal, because animals were created to do what they do. We were created to meditate and reflect and live for our creator. Don't live like, take time to reflect on God, his word, his creation, and be overwhelmed with wonder of him. Ask good questions when you're talking with people. Don't just assume you know their spiritual background. Some people you'll meet already believe there's a creator. Many you meet aren't really convinced of that, although they are suppressing it. So ask questions. Do you believe in God? Do you have any spiritual beliefs? These are open-ended questions that allows them to talk and allows you to reflect on and allows you to be kind in your conversation with them. So creation itself is enough to hold all people accountable to God. We know he exists. All people do. No matter where you are, no matter when you were alive, you know. Number two, God's creation affirms his undeniable authority. His undeniable authority. So his existence, and these overlap and play off each other, of course, because he exists, therefore, he is the final authority of your life. So God's creation affirms, number two, his undeniable authority. Look at verse 20. He goes on further, for his invisible attributes, God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. Now, I need to clarify, because when we say that it reveals God's attributes, it doesn't reveal everything we know about God. What is clear from the text is that it reveals a couple key elements. Power. When you look at the creation, when you look at something that is created, pick anything that's created, it actually does tell you something about whoever it was that created it. If it's elegantly designed, if it's lots of color, lots of just a plethora of different, all these wonderful things, what do we know about him? That creator is more wonderful than the things he created, because they couldn't come from anyone but him. So creation, number two, affirms his undeniable authority. And how does it reveal his authority? Well, eternal power. And it's not the first time we've seen this word, actually. When in Romans, as you've been journeying, when did we see this word power last? Well, Romans 1, verse 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power. Do you remember what I said that Greek word was? The Greek word for power is dunamis, which is where we get our word what in English? Dynamite, right? So salvation is a powerful thing for a soul that is descended and is lost in sinfulness. But guess what? So is creation. When you look at creation, it reveals God's power. And as I was thinking about this, we were driving home from our trip in South Dakota, and we were talking. It wasn't a long, drawn-out thing, but I was just thinking about this. We're driving down the road at 65. We're moving straight. The earth is spinning at the same time I'm driving straight, and the earth, at the same time I'm driving, the earth is rotating and spinning, and it's also rotating around the sun all at the same time. Then I looked it up. It was like, okay, so the earth is spinning at an average of 1,000 miles per hour. Spinning. Well, you and I are just sitting here. And it's rotating around the sun at the same time at 65,000 miles per hour around the sun, while you and I get in our cars and drive around. That speaks to the absolute power of God. It doesn't take a lot of brain power to say, God is powerful. Whoever made all of this is so powerful. And he is divine. When it talks about his divine nature, it's saying that creation reveals not only his power, but that he is the only God, the divine one. And when you look at creation, there's a lot of evidence just from creation itself that shows the uniqueness of one God creating all of this. So eternal power, divine nature. And how then? How are these attributes clearly perceived? Because it says in the text that these attributes of eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. And it says, from what has been made. Clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. Now, if you focus your attention and eyes on that phrase, from what has been made, that is the same word that we have in Ephesians 2, verse 10, that says we are his workmanship. And it's the Greek word poema. Now, what English word do you think, if you were to think and meditate on this word, what English word do you think we get out of the word poema? It's poem. So we get our word poem from the Greek word poema, and God is using this word here to say that creation is, I'll use the English word, the poem of God. It was as if God himself was writing out this elegant poem, but he's doing it through creation, creating out of nothing. And you and I and this whole world are his poetry. Then it's used again, talk about our salvation, that we are the poem of God. We are his workmanship. See, in a world looking for hope, looking for value, looking for something to hold on to, yet in a culture where we have everything that anyone could ever want, we have freedom that anyone could ever want, we are able to do the things that nobody else could do in history, and yet we're miserable. Because you were created for a purpose, and that is to know God and to know his Son and to understand the power of the gospel that can set you free. If you here this morning, you don't know Christ, let the creation speak. Let God's word speak to your heart that you need a Savior. You need to know your Creator and turn to him. Turn to him now. Turn to him in forgiveness. Turn to him and call out to him to be saved. But think of this power in creation. The sun produces enough energy to produce 2,880 trillion light bulbs that will never go out. Even the energy of storms, tornadoes, and hurricanes produce massive amounts of energy. One scientist estimates that the average energy produced by a hurricane at any given moment measures in at 200 times the world's electrical generating capacity. Who is harnessing this energy? Where does this power come from? It speaks to the Creator. From the greatest things to the galaxies and the sun and the stars to the smallest little bacterium, which you've been in science class or do like biology, the flagellum, that little motor that moves the bacterium around, there's 50 parts with O-rings, an engine, a propeller, 50 parts that if one are missing in that little flagellum, the whole thing will break down. And we're told that's an accident. We know better. But see, it's so clear that a committed atheist has to work hard at avoiding God's authority as the Creator. I'm going to give you a couple quotes. They have to work hard at it. They have to suppress the truth. We know because God says they have the truth that he exists. So they've got to hold that down. They got to work. It's hard to be an atheist because you've got to work at keeping the truth you know out of sight. Richard Dawkins is probably one of the most famous atheists of our day. And he says this: biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. You see how he has to hold it down? Biology is the study of things, of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. He knows it. Well, it looks like it's designed, but it's not. Keep telling yourself it's not. It's not. It's not designed. I mean, I know it looks designed. It's not. It's just an illusion, he said. It's an illusion that it looks designed because we know the science behind how a snowflake is formed. Therefore, it's not designed. It's just stuff coming together. Liar. Lying to himself. He said in a movie, you may have seen the movie back a few years back now called Expelled, about intelligent design. And he was having an interview where someone kept pressing him, well, where did this stuff come from? Okay, but where did that come from? Where did that come from? And here's what he said. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved, probably by some Darwinian means, to a very high level of technology, and they designed a form of life that they seeded onto this planet. So even he, when pressed and pressed and pressed, could not commit himself that nothing created something. Well, maybe aliens did it. Got to keep that truth down. Got to keep it out of sight. One other quote was Francis Crick, who is one of Britain's greatest scientists, hailed as one of Britain's greatest scientists who helped actually map out the DNA of the human being, so the DNA and all the strands. And he said, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Think about that. He's telling students, he's writing to people, you want to be an atheist? You want to be a good biologist, good atheist? Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see is not designed, but rather evolved. I know it looks like it's designed. Just it's not, okay? It's not. I know it looks designed. No, can't have that. Just keep telling yourself it's not. Because again, there's only such thing as convenient atheism. They don't want to submit to a creator. They don't want to be accountable to him. Now, as we walk through this, see, we understand that God is holy and righteous. See, he would never condemn someone. He would never send someone to hell unless he was just in doing so. God is a good, holy, righteous judge, but often what people like Richard Dawkins do is they create a God in their own image, a couple of them. They create material and they say, well, matter was eternal. You're just worshiping matter. But then what they do is they overlay onto Christianity to say, we're going to focus only on the God of the Old Testament, and we're going to tell people that God is just this hateful, wrathful person. He just hates all people, and he can't wait to just kill them all. That's not the God of the Bible. That's a God of his own making. See, God is righteous and holy, but he's also perfectly love and just and gracious, and he would never send someone to hell unless he was just. See, creation is available to all. It's undeniable by all. See, if you and I, if we rejoice in these truths and believe the gospel, how does this apply to us? This whole discussion about creation. Are you living in submission to his authority? Or are you living for yourself? Do you say on Sunday, God is creator, but on Monday, you're the creator? You're in charge. Do you say to your parents' kids, yeah, I know God exists. Yeah, God exists. But you live as if you are God and you want what you want, when you want it, and how you want it. Now, why do I know that? Because I was a kid, and as an adult, I still struggle with the same thing. You're not alone. Are you living in submission? Because when you look at the creation, you wake up and open your eyes every day. You breathe his air. You look at his beauty. You enjoy all these different hobbies and different things. They all come from him. Do you give him glory? Or do you act like it's all yours? See, because your heart's going to be committed to something. Either God or something else. Your heart's deceptive. Your life, your thoughts, behavior, and actions reveal what your heart is committed to. What you are in submission to ultimately drives your life. See, the evidence of creation itself is enough to hold all people accountable. You see it in the text. What can be known about God is plain. What can be known about his power is plain. And here's the overwhelming conclusion as Paul descends in the elevator down the descent of human depravity. He says in verse 20, they've been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Jesus said in John 12:36, while you have the light, believe in the light, that you may become sons of the light. See, God has given a light of creation to every human being, and they will either take that light and go, there's a God, I got to know him, I'm going to search for him. And you know what? God will be found by them. God will send missionaries to them. God will bring the gospel to them so that they, just at the spark of their inclination of saying, I want to know the Creator, God sees it and is gracious and says, send him. Send him the gospel. You see why you have the light? Believe in it. You could sit in these pews and be around the light. Kids, youth, adult, you can sit in these pews for year after year and week after week, and you're around the light, but you don't have the light. Call out to Christ. Become a son or daughter of the light by saying, God, I know you're Creator. I know that you died to save me, and I need you. Please forgive me and save me. And then you can begin to use his creation in a way to glorify him. But as we descend further and further, we're going to see that man didn't stop at creation. Man kept descending, kept spurning the light. And even though it's dark down there, it's there to show us how great and majestic and unmeasurable his love is for us. Where it says in Romans 5:8 that even while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us.